happen if the first human beings before the creation of the universe, before Eden, were the first beings to see the birth of the world? The Bible mentions the sons of God. But who were they in reality? Angels of the past, souls or celestial entities that humanity has forgotten. In the book of Job, God asks a troubling question. When I laid the foundation of the earth, where were you? When all the stars of the dawn were singing and the children of God were cheering. Job 28 verse 4 verse 7. This context tells us that before the human race, these mysterious beings were already in existence, and they thought about the universe with joy. But if this is true, then what role did they play in history? Why is it that they are never talked about? And what happened to them after Adam came? Today we will delve into this riddle, which challenges the traditional perspective of the universe. Whatever you are looking for is the purpose of man. And your perspective on the mysteries hidden in the pages of the Bible can change forever. If you are ready to find out this mystery, then write in the comments. The mystery begins. From the beginning of time, the story of the universe has been told in the form of that moment when God made man from the dust of the earth and breathed life into his nostrils. But what would happen if this was not the beginning in reality? What would happen if before Adam took his first step into the universe, something big and unknown was already in existence? The ancient Bible texts hide the parts of a story that are probably never discovered. In the book of Job, God challenges man with the question of trouble. When I laid the foundation of the earth, where were you? When all the stars of the dawn were singing, and the children of God were singing, how is this possible? It is said that the Son of God was already there before the creation of man. The traditional story tells us that the messengers of heaven were created to serve God. But were they really just messengers of heaven, or did they have something else in their nature? To understand this mystery, we need to go back to the time when light was separated from darkness. In that brief moment, the Bible describes how God laid the foundation of the world. But nowhere is it mentioned that he was alone. If he was the Son of God, the witness of creation, then it means that his existence was before man. But what was his purpose? Was he the observer, the emancipator, or perhaps the owner of such a world that he later entrusted to mankind? Do you understand? The key to this mystery is not only found in the book of Job, but is also found in Genesis 6. It is a part of the book that describes the descent of the children of God on earth and their conversation with humans. It is a task that many people describe as breaking in the divine system, a heavenly invasion in the secular world. If this is true, then it means that if this is true, then it means that the human race was not the first to live in the creation of God. Rather, it reached a stage where other institutions were already in existence. Ancient mathematical writing and Jewish traditions speak of a time when heaven and earth were far more connected than we imagined. It is believed that there was a time when God and man were in coexistence, but something has changed. Someone has placed the sons of God in the story of creation for a distant role. Was it a divine order or a rebellion? If these creatures were part of the original line of creation, then their disappearance from the main story can indicate that their purpose was obstructed, perhaps due to sin, perhaps due to struggle in heaven. The Bible describes a great battle in heaven, a clash of forces which resulted in the destruction of Lucifer and his disciples. But what will happen if nothing from these children of God falls? But what is the big question that is removed from the human plan? If these creatures were already present in front of man, does this mean that Adam was not the beginning, but was the beginning of something? The thought is troubling, but it is not impossible. The Bible gives us pieces of a puzzle that seem incomplete. It seems as if some pieces of history have been lost over time or are hidden. But if these children of God were witnesses of creation, then what happened to them later? Did they become heaven, live, or descend into the material world? And most troubling, do they still have an impact on human history? The answer may be closer to our imagination, but to find them, we need to know in depth what the Bible actually says about these creatures. If the children of God were in existence before the creation of man, Then what role did they play in the universe before the advent of Adam? The Bible tells us that these creatures saw the creation of the world, but were they only observers, or did they play an active role in the work of God? The Bible tells us that the creation of man was not a single even. In many instances the Lord speaks in the Word of God, as it is written in Genesis, that we should make man equal to himself according to his form. This Word of God has been a subject of debate for centuries. Some believe that it contradicts the Trinity, but others suggest that God was addressing a heavenly host, a group of divine beings who had taken part in the administration of the universe. This idea has been reinforced in Psalm 22:1, which says that God is in the assembly of gods. He does justice among the gods. Here the word of God, Elohim, is used to refer to God and the other spiritual beings around him. Does this mean that the children of God were part of a much more complex structure than we imagined? If these sons of God were created before the human race, then they could have special responsibilities in the divine system. Some ancient scriptures tell us that they ruled some areas of heaven and earth, and they were given the right to rule the aspects of the universe. But if this is true, then what happened to their Lord when God created man and gave him the earth to rule? This is the place where a possible struggle arises. In Genesis 1:28, God commands Adam and Eve to fill the earth with water and to control it. If the human race has obtained this right, does this mean that someone else had it before? Was there a transition of power in the universe? Some scriptures suggest that this was the cause of a great rebellion in heaven. If the children of God have played a central role in the face of the human race, then perhaps not everyone can easily accept the arrival of man as God's new image in the universe. In Genesis 14 and Genesis 28, we find such ancient scriptures that describe the fall of a pregnant calf known as Lucifer. What? The reason for his fall was his desire to rise above God and establish his throne. What? This incident may be related to the child of God, if some of these creatures had not accepted that new creation which God had established with humanity. Then their rebellion could have been the point of breaking which took them away from the divine purpose. This theory will explain why some of God's children appear in the form of such people in the Bible who disobey God's will and are ultimately blamed. But there is something even more disturbing. In Genesis 6, we find an incident which is contrary to traditional understanding. When man began to rise above the earth and he gave birth to daughters, then the sons of Go saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they chose all of them and married them. Genesis 6:2. This incident shows that God's children came to earth and took human wives. How is it possible to talk to humans like this for spiritual beings? Was this the work of rebellion, or was it part of a big plan? The consequences of this union were devastating. Genesis 6:4. This inspired God to take a tough decision. Water flood the sea. Corruption of humans and the abomination of God's sons inspired the Creator to purify the earth and to begin with Noah and his family. But this raises a disturbing question. God's children rebelled and came into the world of humans. What happened to those who remained loyal? Have they disappeared from history, or do they still play a role in God's plan? Purely in the Bible, we continue to look at the circumstances of these creatures in some positive aspects, and in other, unclear aspects. In Ayub, God's children stand before God in heaven. In Daniel 10, we talk about spiritual beings who rule over the nations of the earth. In Ephesians 6, Paul warns us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers of power and darkness. If God's children have not completely disappeared, then what role do they play in today's world? Do they still work behind the scenes of human history? Are we really alone in the universe? Or are we still a part of a divine plan that we find difficult to understand? If God's children existed before humans, and some people came down to mingle with humans, then what happened to them after the flood? Have they completely disappeared, or do they still play a role in human history? The Old Testament tells us that the earth was destroyed due to the unity between God's children and humans. It inspired God to bring the flood. It was a divine justice that asked the world to purify the world and to fulfill its original purpose. However, in the Holy Scriptures such descriptions are found that suggest that these beings did not completely disappear. After the flood in Genesis 13, the Israelites, who were looking for the land of Canaan, reported the presence of the Nephites. There I saw demons who were the sons of Anak and the descendants of the Nephites, and we, in our opinion, were like rats. This tells us that the descendants of God's children somehow lived, either through the lines of magic or through the second event of God's intercession in humanity. If this is true, then it means that perhaps some of God's children continued to work on the earth, perhaps not like before, but its presence was felt. Many cultures of the world, from Sumer to Egypt to Greece, tell the stories of those gods who descended from the sky to lead, to share knowledge, or to communicate with humanity. Could there be any connection between these stories and the children of God? But here, another troubling question arises. If some of these creatures kept communicating with humanity, what happened to those people who remained faithful to God? The Bible tells us about the angels of heaven and the heavenly creatures who continue to work within the divine plan of God. For example, in Daniel 10, a messenger sent to speak to Daniel is delayed due to a battle with the prince of Korez, a person who seems to be representing the spiritual unity of great power. It turns out that an unseen war is being waged in heaven between those people who continue to serve God and who want to destroy humanity. If some of the children of God have fallen into rebellion, does this mean that they are against these creatures? This conflict may be related to the last destiny, the children of God. In 2 Peter 2:4, we are told that God did not leave the messengers who sinned but put them in the pit and put them in darkness. In Jude 1:6, it is also mentioned that those heavenly messengers who did not accept their sin and left their homes, they were chained in darkness. This context is described as a special punishment for those people who have rebelled. However, the Bible also mentions other spiritual beings who are still active in the world. Ephesians 6:12 warns us that our struggle is against the leaders and the powers and the rulers of this world's darkness, and the spiritual parties. This tells us that although some have been chained, others have continued to influence humanity. Is it possible that the children of God who have been faithful to God are still playing a role in God's plan? If so, then their role can be like the heavenly messengers who act as messengers and protectors. The statement of the heavenly beings has been used as an important role in the events of the end times, which confirms the idea that there is a spiritual leader in the work. But the big question is, if the children of God still have an influence in the world, then how can we recognize them? In the Bible we see that God's heavenly messengers and divine powers have spoken to humans throughout history. From the vision of the future to the adventures in the jungle, the presence of spiritual beings in the story of the Bible seems to be a constant. If this is true, then is it possible to continue to appear in today's world? Can the events of history, the beliefs of ancient civilizations, or the spiritual events also have a sign of its influence, which we have not yet fully understood? As we go through this mystery, we will find out the various principles that try to explain the role of God's children in the modern world. Because if they were in existence before Adam, and if their story continued after the flood, then it means that their influence can still continue. If the sons of God were in existence before humans, and some of them descended on earth and violated the divine system, then a troubling question arises. After the flood, what effect did their existence have on humanity? Did their story end with divine punishment, or did their influence continue hidden in time? In Genesis 11, after the purification of the world, we find a major event: the creation of Babel's dome. The people gathered here with a courageous purpose. Come, let us build a city in a dome, which will reach to a small heaven and will be named, so that it will spread all over the earth. Genesis 11, verse 4. But who or for what reason challenged God like this? Babel's Old Testament tells us that God has deceived people's tongues and scattered them all over the earth. But whatever gives attention happens immediately afterwards. The description of the system, in 32:8-9, an important context, reveals some surprising things. When the supreme leader divided the other castes and separated the children from the humans, Then he set the borders to the count of God's children. This means that some heavenly institutions have authority over the people of the earth. In ancient Hebrew culture, it was believed that some nations were influenced by special spiritual powers, which explains why in the Bible, Daniel 10, some spiritual powers are mentioned, for example the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. If the sons of God were appointed to other castes, then it can be explained why so many ancient cultures worshipped powerful gods with similar qualities. From Sumerian gods to Egyptian, Greek and Mesoamerican gods, in almost every civilization, to talk to humans, to teach them secret knowledge, and in some cases, to ask for worship. Is this God the child of God described? Could it be? If some of these institutions strayed from the divine purpose and began to receive worship from humans, then it will explain why idol worship is the biggest crime against God. In Psalm 82, God judges these creatures. I said, "You are God, and all are the children of the Lord. But being human, you will all die like a ruler." Psalm 226:7. This part tells us that some of God's children misused their rights to worship God, and instead of taking the human race to God, they misled people in the worship of other gods and corrupt practices. In the entire Old Testament we see how God deals the future generations and Israel. But if these sons of God were influenced by the nation of Israel, then what happened? The Messiah came into the advent of Jesus marked an important turning point in the New Testament. We see an invisible battle in heaven. Jesus talks about the fall of Satan. I saw Satan falling from heaven like lightning. This tells us that the work of the Messiah affected not only the human race, but also the spiritual system. In Colossians 2:15, we are told that Jesus took down the chiefs and powers, and showed them in public, and won them over on if the children of God had taken over the nations after Babel. Then the death and resurrection of the Messiah could have marked the beginning of the end of his reign. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul warns that the spiritual war is still going on. We are not against flesh and blood but against the chiefs and powers and the rulers of the darkness. This suggests that the power of the fighting creatures has weakened, but their influence is still in the world. The big question is, how does this influence still manifest? If the Bible warns us that the spiritual powers are trying to control the nations, then what is the reason between historical events, power, systems, and good and evil? As we move forward in this mystery, we will find out how these children of God can work in today's world, and what is their final destination. If the children of God were divided into nations, then how did they influence people's destiny and worship God? What happened to them over time? Do they still work, or have their powers been completely destroyed? To understand their fate, we need to see how the Bible describes the spiritual struggle behind the veil. Throughout the history of Israel, we have seen a constant struggle of a true God and the influence of spiritual institutions that led the nations astray in idol worship. In Deuteronomy 32, Moses warns Israel that he incited other gods to burn and angered them with evil deeds. He sacrificed demons who were not God and gods whom they did not know. He gave new gods whom your fathers were not afraid of. Here the Bible clarifies that these gods whom the nation sacrificed were not mere human inventions, but were real spiritual institutions who presented themselves as gods and asked for worship. But if they were the sons of God who had the power over the nations, then what was their real intention? In the book of Daniel we find a deeper perspective on this struggle. In Daniel 10, after praying and fasting for 21 days, a mysterious event takes place. In the end, he sees a heavenly messenger who tells him that his answer was sent from the first day. But the prince of Pharis stopped him, and he could not proceed until Michael, one of the heavenly princes, came to his aid. This context reveals an unseen struggle where some creatures dominated some areas of the earth. The prince of Pharis was not a human king but a spiritual institution who ruled over the Persian Empire. The truth is that Michael, a heavenly messenger of God, had to kneel Daniel's messenger. It is evident that these creatures were still fighting for the control of the nations. If this had happened in the days of Daniel, then what is stopping it today? In the New Testament we find many instances of these spiritual powers against the kingdom of God. In 2 Corinthians 4, Paul writes that the God of this world has blinded the intellect of the unbelievers, indicating a unity that continues to work in the world to take humanity away from the truth. Jesus himself faced the devil where the devil offered him the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worship. Matthew 4:8-9. It is evident that until that time the devil and his accomplices still had the power of the world on the structures. But if Jesus came to destroy their works, then what changed after his victory on the cross? In Colossians 2:15, Paul says that Jesus took away the powers and showed them to the people and won them on the cross. This means that through his sacrifice the Messiah broke the right that these institutions had on the nations. From that moment on, the news spread all over the world challenging the spiritual God whom these creatures had used with the power of the devil. But the Bible clearly states that the effect of the devil is not completely gone. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul warns the believers that they are still facing the rulers of power and darkness. This indicates that the spiritual war is still going on. This brings us to a key question. If these children of God are still working, then how do they influence the modern world? In the book of Proverbs we find a disturbing picture of how the world system is under the influence of the dark spiritual powers. The Great Father has been described as a person who misleads the nations with his wealth and power. And in Proverbs 18:2 we are told that this is the abode of the wicked and the mother of every impure soul. This tells us that the kingdoms of the Yajnapuritanta have fallen. The same spiritual powers that were behind them are still active in various forms. They no longer present themselves as such gods whom people openly worship. But their influence continues to work in the political, economic, and cultural spheres. If this is true, then the spiritual war described in the Bible is not an incident of the past, but the reality of the present. Humanity is still trapped in a global struggle between light and darkness, between God's kingdom and those who seek to control the world. We need to ask ourselves this question: how can we understand the impact of this? How do these creatures mislead people from the purpose of God? And the most important thing is that what does the Bible tell us about their end? The answer to these questions